When I arrived to start a new ministry at a new church, following a beloved former minister who had served for 28 years, I was surprised that one of the first things a number of people said to me, and they were warm and welcoming, and they said it with great joy. They said, I'm so glad you're here because now you can change the light bulbs that light up the clock tower at night. Now, this was a church, a New England church built in 1809, and it had a very tall clock tower, about 150 feet high, and the light bulbs were near the top, and they shone on the clock at night. And it seems that the beloved former minister, when he was a little younger, used to go all the way up the stairs to the clock tower and go onto the roof and tie a rope to the railing and lean over and change the light bulbs. Now, as he got older, he didn't do this anymore, and they had to pay someone. And the message that I got was, now you're here, we won't have to pay someone to do this anymore. Now, I got dizzy just thinking about it. And I was so longing to say, yes, of course, because I wanted them to like me and accept me, and I wanted to serve them in every way I could. And I thought about going up to nearly the top of the clock tower, and I thought to myself, no. And I said no, and it was fine. It was the same church that there was an attractive sign in front of the historic building with the minister's name. And the church called me in May, and when I arrived in August, and for another 3 months, the sign had the former minister's name. And a visitor commented to me after the service that my name was unusual and asked if it was a family name. And I said, Jennifer? And the visitor said, no, and pointed to the sign, Edward. Other ministers have shared some of their stories with me about the expectations they experience and the surprises that they encounter as they start a new ministry. And the name of the minister becoming confused between the new minister and the minister who's just left. It's a very common issue. One minister reported that after having been there 6 months and then changing the office hours were posted under the former minister's name, which surely must have been a little confusing to people. What, is our former minister coming back to have office hours? Now, one young woman minister, and this is a story a lot like mine with the light bulbs. She was, when she was first welcomed to the new church she was serving, a member of the church who was part of the building and grounds committee really eagerly welcomed her and asked her to come down into the basement, explaining that sometimes in the winter the furnace went out, and so she would have to restart it. Now, it turns out that what this required was for her to take up a long, not too long, but a stick, a thin stick, and then lie down on the basement concrete floor and reach into the bowels of the furnace and press a valve with the stick, and that would restart the furnace. She thought about it, and she also said, no. Can you imagine doing that on a Sunday morning? Lie on the basement floor. There are many stories. One is, what do people expect of the new minister? One discovered that she was expected, without any previous conversation, to facilitate a small group ministry group that met every Friday afternoon, when, as I would, am usually hard at work on the Sunday service. Ministers often find that when they arrive, people expect them to know the Christmas traditions and to carry them out exactly as they've always been carried out, often without telling them anything about what they are. One minister followed two co-ministers and was startled to discover that the two co-ministers, who were the beloved former ministers, really didn't care whether their retirement contributions were made on time or even at all. Disconcerting for the new minister, who then had to insist. One minister had trouble getting paid each month because whether or not she got paid depended on whether or not the treasurer who wrote the checks was happy with her conduct. But there are a number of stories of experiences that ministers have had that just are heartbreaking, because so many of us really long to provide the pastoral care that people need. And so one of my colleagues visited someone in the hospital who'd had a routine procedure done. And this church member cowered in terror when she saw the minister enter the room, because she thought that ministers only visited if you were dying. And that's a common story. And in fact, A. Powell Davies, early in his ministry in Washington, D.C., visited one of his members in a D.C. hospital, and the person was then certain that they were in a terminal stage. It breaks my heart to think that because of a difference in expectations of how ministers behave, that people who were in the hospital felt this incredible fear and terror of actual death. It's not the feeling we wish to instill in our parishioners. And then this is one of my own stories. That it's the how do I know what you expect if no one ever tells me? It was the Sunday before Easter, and we'd finished our services, and the pianist said to me, "You haven't said, but I assume that on Thursday you'll be wanting me to play while you lead the Socinian communion." My response was, "Lead what?" Now, Socinian communion, I didn't at the time even know what it was, and of course no one had told me about this tradition. Now I understand that it's a fairly common thing in Unitarian Universalist congregations, but at that moment it was quite unexpected. Now, I suppose I should say a word about iPads. Now, the advantages of the iPad is that it carries its own light with it, and so there's always good light, and I can read the words. And it's not paper. Paper in a 3-ring binder makes a strange crackling sound when you turn the page, and I don't like that. And without a binder, which is actually how I was taught, it's nice because you can slide the page over. You don't have to hit the microphone with it. Just slide it over. It's very unnoticeable. Except, well, let's just say that through extensive scientific testing, I have proved that I will drop all the pages on the floor, or fail to realize as I walk into the church that the last page of my sermon is missing. Now, some of my colleagues like the iPad for readings, but prefer a printed manuscript for sermons. And one of my friends is really particular about using a manuscript for sermons and printing only about one paragraph in the center of each page, which means that for a Sunday morning sermon, she usually has more than 50 pages. Now, in my hands, that would be the equivalent of 52 pickup in a windstorm. And it's more than just 50 pieces of paper. I can't do that. I can't use that much paper, but I don't need to because the iPad works for me. Now, I know. In fact, just this past week, I found a Tell Us About It note that was at the bottom of a stack of papers that I thought I'd looked at and they were just set aside for filing. And the note said how much this person, this member of the congregation, yearned for a service without monitors or iPads. And it breaks my heart. You know, I love being able to show you images that resonate with the message and music of the service. And the iPad is what works for me. It's part of who I am. I can change a lot of things. I can make a lot of adjustments when I come to a new congregation. But I can't do everything that every member wants. And in fact, not all members want the same thing. So, you know, the moral of the story is that a minister is not a light bulb like those floodlights in the clock tower. You don't just take out the old one and replace it with a new bulb, maybe a brighter bulb or a dimmer bulb or one that's more eco-friendly. It's necessary to open the heart sufficiently to perceive and welcome the whole person, whether it's a minister or a new manager or a new person who walks in the door, or some of those people you've known a long time. Wholeness. My heart has become capable of many forms. We know that reactions and perceptions and preferences differ. To be open to hearing all of those differences is part of my job and is part of yours. If there aren't different perspectives within a circle of friends, just widen the circle a little and you'll find them. Stakeholder meetings, you know, that's how we hear those different perspectives, the perspectives that aren't just within our own social networks. When I get to this point in a transition ministry, I'm always asking this question. What happened when the now retired minister, the beloved former pastor, first came here? Now, everyone always says, there's always someone in the congregation who remembers, usually a lot of people, that the minister actually had a kind of rocky road at first, that not everyone really was fond of them. And it took a while. I hear this everywhere I go. But there was one church, not this one, there was one church where the response, the universal response of people who had been there at the time astonished me. The beloved minister had retired after 16 years of devoted ministry. And people answered that question with an immediate and heartfelt response. Oh, when he first came, he had a terrible time. People were really impatient. It was a good thing he got cancer. Because when he got sick, we cut him some slack. We weren't going to fire him when he'd just been diagnosed with cancer. So we had time to get to know him and time to get to love him. As a strategy for successful long-term ministry, it's probably best not to rely on the minister getting cancer in the first year. But what you can do is keep an eye out for the bumps in the road and respond. Assume the best intentions, give primacy to curiosity, communicate, talk directly to the minister if possible, write in the Tell Us About It book. And stakeholder meetings. Yes, I know not everyone likes the stakeholder meeting format, but the thing about the stakeholder meetings is that you not only get to share with the minister what you're feeling, but you're also sharing with the whole circle, and you're inevitably hearing from perspectives that are not like your own. And that may be the most important part of what happens in a stakeholder meeting. The Book of Chinese Wisdom, the I Ching, millennia old, talks about pigs and fishes and the difficulty they have understanding each other. Now, we human beings, we're pigs and fishes. I don't need to specify which is which. But we often have trouble understanding one another. In human terms, each of us is different, and sometimes we absolutely are as incomprehensible to one another as pigs and fishes. And that's when assumptions, everyone's a fish, everyone's a pig, assumptions become a wall that separates us, an impassable barrier. As people who seek spiritual and ethical growth, we must tear down that wall. In our relationship of covenant, our bond of union, our values impel us to seek one another's inner truth, the whole of the other person, not simply the superficial. I like the I Ching's idea that opening up to each other's inner truth is actually the only effective way we can persuade or influence one another, but it's more than just a strategy. The motive we must have for bonding with and understanding one another can't be to wield power or influence to persuade. If our principles mean anything at all, if they are to be lived reality in our UU congregations, our bond of union is to discover each other's inner truth. That's what it means to be part of a beloved community that shares vision and values. The bond between members and ministers is hollow unless it's based on the conviction that we are present in this life to hear one another's truth. Only then can we form lasting bonds with one another. A bond based only on shared interest or a shared point of view is not based on inner truth. It's merely a bond of opportunity, like the bonds formed in American political life, opportunistic power brokering that ensures polarization and ruthless deadlock. Unitarian Universalism must be better than that. If we're to be with one another in community, a community of mutuality and compassion, then our bonds must be based on our values, the bigger picture. Not whether the minister is the perfect minister for one person or another, because no one can do that, but because of what the community shares, its values, its aspirations, its longings, its history and accomplishments. In dealing with one another, in dealing with a new minister, assume nothing. None of us is a light bulb. To find that inner truth, we must listen and understand. And we must trust others, trust those around us to listen to us and to understand us. When my heart becomes capable of many forms, I can see how each person speaks from their own inner truth. It's part of my covenant with you and part of your covenant with one another. We are to make our hearts capable and then follow the path of love.